We're here with Andrew Triska from andrewtriska.wordpress.com. And Andrew, I'm Kathy Bartoli from the intimacydojo.com. Andrew, you're going to be talking about reshaping the language of sexuality and intellectual disabilities in clinical practice and beyond at Woodhull's Sexual Freedom Summit this August in a couple months. And I think that's really powerful. The way where we name things actually gives them context for people.
Basically, language shapes how we practice clinically. So, the language that we use to talk about sexuality in intellectually disabled people shapes how we actually think of them and how we present ourselves to them when we're practicing with them or with their families. So, the words we learn as clinicians, they're not just words. They're also like frameworks.
Yes.
So like if we use words like, one of the words you hear a lot with respect to intellectual disabilities is like the word independence.
Mm-hmm.
So I mean that's something that seems like a very neutral, innocuous word, but in actuality a lot of the time it devalues people who depend on others.
That's true. It implies a lacking if you don't, if you can't have that. You use the example of independence. What are some other examples where language is shaping how people see whether they're sexual or powerful and embodied or not?
So there, one that I use a lot in when I talk about issues like these is it's actually the word issues and a related word problems. Like I'll give you an example from from my job now. I work in inpatient psych at Methodist Hospital in Brooklyn.
Oh, wow.
And I was reading a treatment plan the other day for a trans client,
Mm-hmm.
and it said that this patient who was inpatient. I don't even remember what the presenting problem was, but this person had what was described on the treatment plan as gender identity issues, and you see that a lot actually more often in respect to people who are marginalized than to people who aren't. You see that in intellectually disabled people. A lot of the time you'll see somebody saying or writing in a report, this person has sexuality issues, gender identity problems, and basically it makes their sexuality or their sexual expression, their gender expression, into a problem. Now, of course, intellectually disabled people absolutely can have problems. They might identify them themselves. They might identify their gender identity or their sexuality. They might identify points of that or aspects of their lives as problems. But the problem comes when we as clinicians define those as problems without actually asking them, do you see these fundamental aspects of yourself? Do you see the fact that you're gay or trans, or that you have questions about sexuality, or that you're expressing your sexuality? Do you actually see that as a problem? And in most cases, it actually isn't a problem. It's just like a question they have, or something they might be doing that, maybe doesn't, fit in with the rest of society. It's not inherently something negative. So we have to be really careful when we imply these value judgments as clinicians.
No, that's really powerful and insightful, because I came out as a lesbian in the 1990s, early 1990s, and I felt like I had a problem because I've been raised very heteronormative, and I was having these feelings and I was questioning my experiences, and I can understand that. And it was challenging to go against convention at that point. It wasn't as accepted as it is now. And I could see that as someone who is also marginalized intellectually, like, how do you, it was hard enough without that challenge to figure out how to move forward and where I was. And then having medical people, authorities telling you have issues could be like, oh, I'm broken. Oh dear.
Right, that's one thing that intellectually disabled people deal with a lot. They have a lot more of these authority figures in their lives than intellectually typical people do. I mean, if I don't want to see a particular doctor, or therapist, or somebody I'm working with, as a patient or a client, I can leave. I'm economically privileged. I've got a job. I'm not depending on my parents or on other people to take me to appointments or something. But if you don't have this choice of who you see or how you interact with them, then the language that they use is going to be much more important. It's going to be much more important to actually universalize these concepts of how we should talk to intellectually disabled people about their sexuality. Because if they get a bad clinician, if they get a clinician who's just not very versed or just sensitive and compassionate about these issues, then it's going to have much more of an impact on their lives than on somebody who's intellectually typical.
Yeah, and it's hard enough, the challenges they're facing. That just feels incredibly sad to know that some people are just struggling because the person's using language in a way that doesn't empower them. How did you start questioning the language people use around sexuality?
Well, at the beginning of my career, actually, really, what started me on the career path that I'm on now, I worked at a summer camp for intellectually disabled kids and adults, and I remember when we first started, we were doing our orientation, we devoted, I want to say, like 10 minutes, might have even been 5 minutes, to the topic of sexuality. It was just like a couple of things, and it was really the most visible stuff. We didn't obviously talk about like same-sex relationships. We didn't talk about like camper relationships, other than to say that the policy was that they can't have relationships, which was its own problem. We talked briefly about like masturbation, like just tell them to do it in their sleeping bag. Just like very, very perfunctory stuff. And then, obviously a lot more issues came up. There were campers who outside the camp actually had relationships, but inside the camp basically had to pretend that they didn't, or not really pretend, but more like they could say, this is my boyfriend, this is my girlfriend.
They can act.
Obviously not. And of course there was a double standard, with same-sex relationships. There was actually a lesbian couple who outside the camp, they lived in the same residence. They were a couple, but inside the camp, actually they were told to refer to each other as sisters, which is its own thing.
That's not okay. Like, no.
Yeah, and even you look at stuff like gender identity. There was a boy who would somebody who was ostensibly a boy who would play dress up at camp and would wear a dress, and I remember a lot of the counselors making fun of him for that, either in front of him or behind his back. It was like, all right, let's step back and look at your behavior. You're an adult making fun of a child.
Yeah.
And nobody. This is something that could really have actually been prevented just with a little bit of training. I actually did. A few days ago, I did a training for a camp that my friend, whom I actually met at that camp, has started out in Tennessee, and about the language around like gender identity, which I feel like is something that a lot of camps should have. I mean, anytime you go into you're in a congregational setting like that, you should pay attention to that, as a clinician or a counselor.
Absolutely. And and I guess I can see where there's a lot of issues like publicity around campers are having sex. That could be an issue, but to have them deny that they're in relationships doesn't feel like there's
right. I mean, there were even campers who had children, and it was kind of like, in the outside world, you may have this or that degree of independence or like autonomy, you may make your own decisions, but when you're at camp, you're like essentially, because of your disability, a child.
And I would guess the whole point of camp was supposed to be have fun and empower people, and that doesn't sound empowering at all.
Right, no.
Oh, wow. So as you've got into your practice and you're working with people, can you give us examples of words that you found work better versus like issue or problem or disability or things that are disempowering?
Yeah. So one of just going back to the word independence. I mean, as I said before, it's one of those words that devalues people who are interdependent, who are dependent on other people. A word that is I use a lot more often is autonomous. So the word
Okay.
autonomy, it doesn't imply that you're not dependent on other people, but it implies more that you're making your own decisions to the fullest capacity possible.
Right.
You're the one in charge of your own life, and I think that's really what people mean when they say like independence.
Yeah.
I think that's what a lot of people are getting at. That like, if you see yourself as fully adult, you're seeing, regardless of your ability or your intellectual capacity or what are seen as your deficits,
Yeah.
you're making your own decisions regarding like your body, your sexuality, your gender identity.
Yeah, and it's interesting because I see some monogamous married couples where there's probably less independence or autonomy than some of your clients might have, where I have to check with my partner. I don't know if I like that.
Right,
So
and that's actually, I mean, it's one of those things where we give a pass to people who are not seen as disabled, and we
right.
don't really give a pass to people who are disabled. We value certain forms of independence
Yeah.
over others. So, like, if you're in a couple and you're dependent on your partner, that's seen as a totally different thing than if you are disabled and you're dependent on your parents or an agency or a residence. We say that this person is an adult, even though obviously we rely on the government, we rely on other people, the subway system, all of these.
Yeah, I
These
don't make my own electricity for sure.
exactly like I don't grow my own food,
Yeah.
but those dependencies are seen as like totally normal. You're still an adult. You're still an autonomous person. But when you get to like people who depend on SSI income, people who depend on other people to feed or bathe them or do like toileting tests, that's seen as this kind of illegitimate thing. Well, you're not supposed to have these dependencies. And if you do, that's a privilege that other people are granting you that they can take away at any time.
Yeah, that's really challenging, the privilege of people, because around sexuality too, I understand there's big issues around consent and like how do we decide if someone's able to
Right.
consent or not. But to disempower someone and take away the right to be sexual, that dehumanizes us in many ways too.
Exactly, and that's actually something that I talk about in my presentation. There's a section around the word risk because that has been, when you talk to clinicians about sexuality in people who are intellectually disabled, that's the biggest thing that's the topic that comes up. Like, what is the risk of, allowing or letting this person be sexual or express their gender identity? And I mean, it comes from a compassionate place because obviously we don't want people to be exploited.
Right.
We don't want people to be bullied. But then, we have to, in every decision we make, to the extent that it's in our power to make those decisions, we have to think of the risk on the other side. Like, what is the risk to that person's
Right.
basic sense of humanity? What is the risk, to that person's long-term happiness? And then, even if you as a clinician think that person will be ruined if they express their sexual, or will do something that's not a good idea, will make bad decisions, you also have to think like, what is the risk to that person's, as I said, basic humanity, sense of autonomy? In other words, is that not their risk to take?
Yeah, no, it is, and that's challenging because you want informed decisions, and depending on how challenging the disability is, it may be hard to make a good judgment call on that.
Right. And it's not black and white. I mean, when you do this kind of risk assessment, I know that we're accustomed to thinking of like the capacity to consent as an all or nothing thing. Like, you can either consent to X, Y, and Z, or you can't consent to any of X, Y, and Z. But like, even people who are considered very, very impaired, who have very, very significant difficulties, with their cognition, their judgment, their memory, even those people can be sexual in some ways. They can express their gender in some ways. It's not like there's this big wall where you can only
Thou shalt not pass.
exactly. If there are I mean, intellectual disabilities are not linear. Intelligence is not linear. You can have, certain kinds of judgment and not others. You can,
I look
make.
back at my 20s and I don't have any diagnosed disability, but I look back at my 20s, I'm like, someone should have said no decision making there.
Right, right, and it's like, but imagine if someone did. Imagine if there were somebody making those decisions for you, like
Yeah.
that in itself is like a part of learning, and that's another way, another thing about the way that we talk about intellectually disabled people. Like we're allowed to make mistakes. We're allowed to look back on our 20s and say, why was I such an idiot?
Yeah.
But but you know intellectually disabled people are, you know, often seen as like these delicate flowers that, you don't want them to have any regrets. I mean, what is life without regrets?
Yeah.
Are they not your regrets to have,
We
even
get to,
even if they're catastrophic?
yeah.
It's your risk.
Yeah, no, I love how you talk about this. It's so compassionate and so gentle. Um, and I think it's really important. I think that we have come a long way in how we talk about things, but there's whole orders of magnitude that we can go further. And the more we talk about it, the easier it is for all of us to work together. Um, why did you choose Woodhull as one of your venues for sharing about this?
I mean, it seemed like one of the more progressive venues for these things. I mean, I'm getting emails about like sex toys and stuff. It's just, I feel like it's a play. The speakers are coming from a place of like openness and lack of judgment. I mean, one of the things that you get when you talk about intellectually disabled sexuality, you just get kind of this visceral reaction from people sometimes.
Yeah.
If you're not in a setting where there's that sense of openness, it's like, wait a minute, what are you doing? Are you hurting these people? It's just this very, like I said, it comes from a place of compassion, but the compassion, can sometimes be misplaced. We have to come from a place of both compassion and knowledge.
And like you said, the risk assessment, how much understanding is being put into the decisions that are being made.
Right. Blind compassion does nothing. We need informed compassion.
Yeah. If someone, I think Woodhull it's one of the warmest, most intellectually stimulating events that I go to each year. So I'm so glad you're going to be talking at it. If people wanted to find more resources about this, I think it's such an important topic. They can go to your website. Is there any place else you'd recommend?
Yeah, so I do have a book that just came out in April from Routledge. It's called Sexuality and Intellectual Disabilities, A Guide for Professionals, and the link is on my website. So it's a very concise guide. It's not just meant for clinical professionals. It's also for paraprofessionals, special ed teachers, just anybody kind of in that sphere. So
That's
it's a very
fabulous.
Multidisciplinary book. You can, lay people can even like parents, consumers, just it's a very brief, easy to understand overview of some of these issues.
Oh, that's fabulous. Thank you so much for creating it. I look forward to seeing you at Woodhull, and if you're listening to this and you have questions or comments, please leave them below and we'll try to get back to you. Thank you so much, Andrew.
All right, thank you.